So what we're going to be looking at in the next few videos are these things that we call organic compounds. They're also called biomolecules, or they're called macromolecules, and that's what you're seeing here in these four pictures. We have nucleic acids, lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. And the term organic means that something has carbon in it. And with biology, I always say the first part of biology and anatomy is the hardest, because we have to start small. One of my favorite things to say is structure determines function. You have to understand the structure of something before you understand how it works. Like, I couldn't just start talking about how a car works because I don't understand the parts. Like, you have to know what the carburetor does. You have to understand what the brake fluid does. You have to understand what the windshield wipers do. And cells are the same way. Cells have different parts to them, and cells have different functions. Cells have different jobs. And so in order for us to move into how cells work and why there's all these different kinds of cells in nature, you have to understand the chemicals that are in those cells. Because if a cell has more lipids in it, it's going to have a different job than something that has a whole bunch of this one kind of protein in it. So structure determines function. So we need to look at the different types of chemicals that go into play. And so what I've done is I've broken them up into 3 different videos. And so this video is going to look at what an organic compound is, how we make them, how we destroy them, and then we're going to focus on carbohydrates. Well, like I mentioned before, whenever you see the term organic, organic means it's going to have carbon in it. And so most people are familiar with sugar, C6H12O6. Water, H2O, is not organic, it's inorganic. And so when we talk about organic molecules, these are things that have carbon making them up. So as we go through the different biomolecules or organic molecules in these next few videos, we'll be talking about the ingredients that make them up, the elements, and carbon will be found in all of these. So looking at macromolecules, which I said are also called biomolecules, which are also called organic molecules, these are the 4 main ones that we're going to look at. We have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And they are listed in this order for a reason. In science, when we talk about something being large, like the term macro, that doesn't mean it's so big that we can see it. It's talking about the complexity. How many pieces did it take to put this together? And so in the case of carbohydrates, which most people know of as sugars and starches, these are first on the list. That lets you know that they're not as complex as a nucleic acid, which is like DNA and RNA. So I always use Legos in my analogies. So if you think of carbohydrates as being just this little like Lego kit that you could get at Target for $2 that lets you make a little person. But the nucleic acid is like the huge Millennium Falcon or the Hogwarts kit that has hundreds to thousands of pieces to put together. It's more complex. It's harder to make. It's a lot more complex. So when we look at macromolecules or biomolecules, a lot of times you'll see them listed in this order, and they're listed according to their complexity. So carbohydrates, sugars and starches, they don't have as many pieces to them as a lipid, which is a fat, or a protein, or nucleic acid. So again, structure determines function. So if you only have 5 Legos, I cannot build something really complex. But if I have 5,000 Legos, I can come up with all these different structures and different types of complexity. So speaking of that, again, like I said, I always use Legos as my example. We're going to use the term monomers and polymers. As you know, your root word mono means one and poly means many. So when we talk about organic compounds, we're going to be talking about these things called subunits. You'll also see them called building blocks, or you'll see the term monomer. Think of these as your Legos. Think of these as your ingredients. So in the case of a Lego, I cannot take a Lego apart. If I try to take a Lego apart, the only way I can take it apart is to crush it. And if I crush it, I destroy it. That's how monomers are. Monomers are those ingredients that we start with that cannot be broken down anymore. So it is the smallest thing that I have, and I can't take it apart without destroying it. So that's my Lego. And then I can use those Legos and put those Legos together to build something. And what I'm building contains lots of pieces, so that's what we call a polymer. Now, polymers can be taken apart because they're made up of all these different types of pieces. So monomers is just one ingredient. It is the most basic ingredient. It cannot be taken apart without being destroyed. So it's one Lego. Polymers will be the house or the Millennium Falcon or the Hogwarts, whatever it is that you're building out of all those monomers. So speaking of building, anytime your body needs to put something together, it's going to do what's called dehydration synthesis. Now, what this is referring to, as you know, when you think about dehydrate, that means you're losing water. Well, dehydration synthesis is also called condensation synthesis, because if you know about condensation, that's when you form water. Well, anytime your body has to put something together, water is made in the process. Because think of it this way. We have these two friends down here. We have amino acid OH and we have amino acid H, and they want to work together. So they need to be able to hold hands. They need to be able to link to each other. But they have to get like their ring, they have to take their gloves off in order for their skin to touch so that they can do whatever magic that they're going to do. And so in this process of putting things together, it's called bonding. We're going to be making bonds. And think of bonds as ropes that help tie things together so they don't fall apart. Or think of bonds as when you click those two Legos together. Like you can stack Legos on top of each other, but you've got to click them together to make them stick. Well, that would be like a bond. And anytime your body needs to make a bond, it does what's called dehydration synthesis. And so you know that dehydrate means to lose water, and synthesis means to make. So in the case of dehydration synthesis, the synthesis lets you know that nature is making something. Nature is building something. It's putting something together. And dehydrate lets you know that water is being lost in the process. If you think of it this way, when you are building something, you're working hard, you're sweating, you're losing water. That's what's happening here in dehydration synthesis. Now, the opposite of that is hydrolysis. The root word hydro means water, and lysis means to break. So in this case, I'm breaking something apart. Okay? I'm using that water as an explosion. Think of it as a water balloon. When the water balloon hits something, it explodes open, and something jumps away from it. If you've ever been in a water balloon fight, somebody hits you with that water balloon and it explodes open, you kind of jump back a little bit. Well, think of the molecules as doing that. So a water molecule is used to break apart something. So in dehydration synthesis, we're putting something together and we're sweating. We're making water. In hydrolysis, we need to tear something apart, and we're going to use water as an explosion. So again, using that water balloon example, if you had this Lego creation you made and you threw a water balloon at it as hard as you could, you're going to knock some of those Legos off. You're going to cause some of those Legos to fall off. Well, that's what's happening in hydrolysis. And this is how your body takes things and starts to break them down. And you'll find that dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis tend to occur at the same time. They're opposites of each other. And so in the case of hydrolysis, I am a formula person. I like to use formulas. And so when I talk about hydrolysis, I say that hydrolysis is where I take a big molecule and I add water to it. And that makes small molecule number 1 and small molecule number 2. Okay. The opposite of that would be hydrolysis. Okay. In hydrolysis, I'm going to take 2 small molecules and I'm going to put them together to make a larger molecule, and water will get made in the process. So that's just kind of a general overview of biomolecules. Again, it's very basic. This isn't chemistry, so we're not going to go into it in a lot of detail. But in the case of biomolecules, or your body makes them, it recombines them, it helps break them down. And so what we're going to look at in this video are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are the very first on this list, which means they don't have a lot of pieces compared to the others. Like I said, think of carbohydrates as a little Lego person, while nucleic acids is an entire Lego castle. It's going to have a lot less pieces in it. It's not going to be complex. And in the case of carbohydrates, the name carbohydrate tells you the 3 ingredients it has. Carb contains carbon, O contains oxygen, and hyd, it contains hydrogen. And in the case of carbohydrates are often drawn as in what's called a ringed symbol. So this right here you can see is what we call a carbon ring. So anytime you see a picture, if it has this type overall shape in it, or maybe a pentagram, or a pentagon, a hexagon, an octagon, a stop sign, you're probably looking at a carbohydrate, a sugar of some type. And the most common type of sugar in nature, as you guys know, is glucose. Now, in the case of sugars, only autotrophs, things like plants, some bacteria, algae, are able to make sugar. And you guys know this as the process of photosynthesis. In the case of animals, animals cannot make sugar, but we can take sugar and break it down and turn it into different kinds of sugar. But once our sugar is gone, it's gone. That's why we have to eat it. So in the case of our sugars, we have what we call simple sugars and we have what we call complex sugars. Now, simple sugars, the term simple lets you know these do not have a lot of ingredients. And most of your simple sugars are what we call monosaccharides. Now, just as a word, anytime you see ose, that means it's a sugar. Glucose, sucrose, galactose, deoxyribose, OSC lets you know that that substance that you're looking at is a sugar. Likewise, anytime you see saccha, saccha also means sugar. Anytime you see glue, it's a sugar. Anytime you see gly, like glycogen, it's a sugar. Okay. So don't be afraid to use root words to help you figure out what these things are that we're looking at. Okay. But in the case of monosaccharides, the name means one sugar. This is one Lego. Okay. Monosaccharides cannot be broken down without being destroyed. So this is your monomer. This is your building block. This is what we have to start with. This is my one Lego. And in the case of glucose, glucose is the most common type of monosaccharide in nature. And you guys know its formula is C6H12O6. Now, carbohydrates are first on the list. So that means that they're not complex. So it's pretty easy for our body to break down. That's why when you're hungry and you eat something like a Hershey's bar, like in 30 minutes, you're hungry again because your body broke that sugar down really fast. Something like a Snickers bar, the ads say keep you full longer. Well, that's because they have peanuts in them, and peanuts are proteins. And you now know that proteins are third on this list. So you know that proteins have a lot of bonds in them. They have a lot of Legos. It's going to take more time for my body to take that apart. Now, glucose, fructose, galactose are all types of sugar because they all have an OSE, and they're all isomers. If you remember, I do have a video that talks about ions, isotopes, and isomers. And isomers are chemicals with the same formula, but they have different structures. Again, structure determines function. So what does that mean? Well, in this picture here, you're looking at a picture of glucose. It has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Well, if I were to show you a picture of fructose, it would look different, but it still has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. It would be like if I gave each of you a Ziploc baggie with Legos in it, and you had 6 cherry red Legos, 12 hot pink Legos, and 6 onyx black Legos, and I asked you to build something. All of you have the same ingredients, but you would build something different. Like somebody might build a fence, or somebody might build a chair, or somebody might make a block. You would be making isomers. You all have the same ingredients, but you put them together differently. So monosaccharides are the most common type of sugar, or glucose is the most common type of monosaccharide. And glucose is what plants make in photosynthesis. Fructose is what you think of as fruit juice. And galactose is what we find in different types of grasses. Now, when we start to build, we have what are called disaccharides. And the term disaccharide means two sugars. So this would be like you taking two Legos and clicking them together. And so, for example, what you call table sugar is sucrose. Well, sucrose is made by clicking together a green Lego, which represents glucose, and a fruity red Lego that represents fructose. Now, we're not just taking two different sugars and stirring them in a bowl. This is a chemical reaction. Remember, this is dehydration synthesis. I'm putting something together, and I'm going to lose water in the process. That's why if you look at this formula right here, okay, if you think about it, glucose is C6H12O6. And if I add them together, because that's what fructose is too, in the case of carbon, 6 plus 6 is 12. There's 12 carbons. But in the case of hydrogen, 12 plus 12 is 24. Well, I only have 22 here. And in the case of oxygen, 6 plus 6 is 12. Well, I only have 11 here. Remember, water is H2O. So those two missing hydrogens were used to make water, and the one missing oxygen was used to make water. But these are examples of what we call disaccharides, meaning two Legos have clicked together to make something different. In the case of table sugar, this is sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. Maltose, which a lot of people think of as caramel, is glucose and glucose melted together. And then lactose, which as you guys know, which is milk sugar, is glucose and galactose mixed together. So in the case of simple carbohydrates, just as a review, you have what we call your sugars. And so you're either a monosaccharide or you're a disaccharide. In the case of monosaccharides, you are one Lego. As you can see in this picture, and again, you can see the ringed structure that lets you know you're looking at a carbohydrate. So in the case of glucose here, it's just one Lego. I can't break it down without, I have to crush it. And if I crush it, I've destroyed it. So monosaccharides are made from one sugar. Glucose, fructose, and galactose, they all end in OSC, you've got a sugar. When I start to click my Legos together, I put two Legos together, I have a disaccharide. So again, sucrose, maltose, and lactose are examples of those. But if I keep clicking my Legos together and I keep putting more and more and more together, that's going to make what's called a polysaccharide. And that's what we call a complex sugar. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are what we call simple carbs. And these tend to be the sugars that you think of. When we look at our polysaccharides, these are what we call our complex carbs. Complex lets you know there's a lot of pieces. We put together a lot of stuff to make it. And just some common examples, starch. Starch is what we find in potatoes, carrots. This is how plants store their food. Glycogen, you're like, okay, G-L-Y, you know it's a sugar. This is how animals store food. We can't make sugar, and so any sugar that's left over, we don't want to lose, so we turn it into glycogen. And glycogen in humans is stored in our liver, and this is what our liver uses to feed our red blood cells. Cellulose, you know that cellulose is a sugar because there's OSC in it. Cellulose is what you think of as fiber. So when people take Metamucil, X-Lax, things like that, you're drinking fiber. Okay? And the cellulose is so complex. Think about celery. We've all chewed celery before. We've got those strings, and you can chew and chew and chew, and it never seems to go away. Well, that's cellulose. Think of that as cellulose. It's got a lot of pieces, and so it's really hard to break down. And in the case of humans, it's so complex, our bodies can't break down cellulose. So we actually use it as fibers or a broom to help sweep out our intestines to make sure that food doesn't get stuck in our intestines and rot. And then there's something called chitin. And chitin is a molecule that's found in the cell walls of fungi. And it's also what makes the shells of arthropods, like crabs and shrimp and things like that. So like I said, starch is an example of a complex sugar or a polysaccharide. It has thousands of Legos putting it together. And again, you can see in this picture, you see that ringed structure, you know, the pentagon, hexagon, octagon, all those things. When you see that, let you know that you have a sugar.